I'll get started then. As Ricky said, welcome everyone to today's session. This is the second session in 5 that we're delivering in the Health Economics team at the Health Economics unit. Today you will have me. I'm Lisa Cummins. I'm a lead economist, a health economist at the Health Economics unit. You've got my colleague Ihan. Ihan, do you want to say hello?
Hi, so my name is Ihan. I'm also a health economist and I have background in public health and behavioral economics. Now I'll pass over to...
I'll introduce myself now. I'm Rukia Forshaw and I work for Health Economics Unit as a project manager. Jack will be joining us later, and I've got also Phil on the line. Phil, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you very much. Yeah, sure. I'm Phil Bucknell. I'm also working at the Health Economics Unit as a business consultant. One of the things that I'll be doing is taking over from Rukia on this project for moving forward, so the second cohort really. So yeah, I'll be, unfortunately for you lot, the ugly face you have to look at if you come to any more sessions after this. I do apologise.
Thanks, guys. We don't have Sophie with us today, and Jack isn't here yet. He is going to pop in later as a special guest to talk about some of the work he's doing and how he's using health economics as part of that to help systems make resource allocation decisions. In case you're not familiar with the Health Economics Unit, we are part of the Midlands and Lancashire Commissioning Support Unit. We provide kind of a range of different services kind of across health economics, economic evaluation, population health management, and data science. And we work across the NHS really, from national level to system level to place level. We also work with some third sector organisations and some industry as well. And our aim is to deliver impactful insights to power the future of health and care delivery. So this session today is economic evaluation, service change and transformation. I can't see if anyone has their hand up, but I think we're a pretty small group. So if you have any questions or you want to contribute, do put your hands up or pop a message in the chat, and one of my colleagues will let me know, and I can take questions. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to provide you with an introduction to the use of economic evaluation and health economics at national level. Also use of economic evaluation at organisational and system level. And also we'll cover some different techniques as well then for determining causality. I wonder if we quickly could just get a show of hands to see how many people joined last week's session with Will. Okay, we've got a few. No worries, I've got some quick intro slides and a bit of a recap on what Will covered, so I can quickly go through those. So basically Will covered kind of key concepts in health economics and an introduction to kind of economic evaluation as well. So health economics, it's a branch of economics. Economics in general is concerned with how society allocates scarce resources. And then in health economics, and as health economists, we're interested in the allocation of finite resources to maximize health across the population. So we're typically interested in generating evidence to inform these types of questions. So what should be produced or delivered? How should healthcare be produced or delivered? And who should services be delivered for, or who should receive healthcare? We'll also cover allocation of resources. So as I mentioned, resources are generally finite, and that kind of makes it difficult when it comes to delivering healthcare. because the needs of the population and the demand for healthcare is often beyond what's available to provide. There's not enough resources basically to meet the need and demand. So in England, the NHS budget for this financial year was about £153 billion, and a decision needs to be made at that level around where that funding should be allocated. So as you can see, the majority of that goes to integrated care boards, and then following on from that, we've got around 30 million that goes to direct commissioning. This includes services like primary care services or specialised services or public health, for example. And then the remainder is split across other system level funding or service development or admin program type functions. So as I said, the goal really of a health economist really is to generate evidence to inform decision making about how best to allocate resources and maximise health gain across the population. So it's about trying to get the most we possibly can to improve the health of the population with what resources are available. A key tool or method in our toolbox for doing this is by carrying out economic evaluations. And these are essentially a comparison of costs and outcomes, also known as consequences or effects or benefits. So I apologise in advance for maybe using different terms interchangeably. I will try and minimise that. But it's essentially by comparing costs and different outcomes of two or more alternative courses of action. So this could be two different ways of delivering a service, two different medications, or more medications even, or any treatment or diagnostic, for example. On the cost side, I've included some examples of direct costs here. So could it be things like staffing, overheads, service use, or equipment or anything like that. It's usually measured by multiplying some unit cost by the quantity. So for staffing, for example, if you're comparing the cost of two different models of care, you might want to know the staff composition, the staff grades, how many different staff are working at that level, and then you'd estimate staffing based on the number of staff and at different levels, and the cost then of salary or on costs, or even training. I guess it just depends on the scope of your evaluation. On the other hand, we have outcomes, and these, I've just included some examples here, can include things like measures of health gain. So one key one in health economics is equality, which you may have heard of, which is quality adjusted life year. I'm going to go into that in a bit more detail in a moment, so I won't talk more about that for now. Other examples of outcomes might be improvements in mortality rates or quality of life, or healthy life expectancy, for example. And then other measures might include resource use. So we might be interested in whether or not a intervention reduces length of stay or reduces the likelihood of readmission. So we might also measure outcomes like that. And then we may also be interested in specific clinical outcomes. So maybe improvements in HbA1c in people with type 1 or type 2 diabetes, or BMI, for example. So if we were looking at an intervention like a new self-management app for people with type 2 diabetes, these might be two clinical outcomes that we might be interested in measuring. So any questions on a very, very quick summary of what was covered last week? I apologise, it was quite quick. Mark, do you want to come in?
Thank you. So my question is really about to what extent we might be able to, in the future, create some metric which would in some way measure the benefits to staff. So one of the domains in the 5 quintuple aims of population health management is around staff fulfillment. And we know we've got huge issues with recruitment and retention of staff. And I think it's generally accepted that, you know, the pressures and disappointments of working in overstretched services often drives people into early retirement or just churn through the system. So I wonder whether there's whether it might be useful to include a metric which says, if we've opted for a particular service provision model, is there any relationship between that and less churn, for example, or people staying longer, or the number of people still working in a particular service after the age of 55? Because I think it's one of those non-cashable benefits that is really important actually, but we just never measure it in any way or other.
Yeah, no, I think that's really a really good question. I don't actually have an answer for you right now,
Fair
but
enough.
I guess it depends on the type of evaluation you're running, and for sure, if it's a particular intervention that's improvements leads to improvements in patients, but also improvements to staffing, because that generally has spillover effects and knock-on effects and savings elsewhere. That definitely has a benefit. I'm not aware. I don't know if any of my colleagues on the call are aware of any measures around measuring kind of staff experience specifically. Like we do have like quality of life measures for patients, which kind of might ask them questions about their experience, and they can be generated then into a composite measure. But I don't think any exist for staffing. But I mean, maybe it's not just one measure. Maybe it's taking a number of measures, like as you said, retention, reduction in staff leaving. Just done a project myself looking at the impact of menopause on staff potentially leaving the workforce because of their symptoms. And even in that area, there is so many gaps in the evidence. And so I think it's consistent across healthcare. So it's a big challenge, and I think one that definitely warrants attention. Anybody else want to come in on that?
I think if the costs are, very measurable, any HR department will give you a sort of a unit cost for inducting a new member of staff,
Yeah.
training them up, etc., going through the recruitment costs.
Yeah.
So I'd love us to get to a situation where, at least if it was through a surrogate metric,
yeah,
we could balance that out a little bit and
even when
surface the benefits.
In that recent analysis I did, I was trying to think of the cost of recruitment, cost of training, which is available in some areas in unit costs. Things like staff cover for agency or bank staff, that was near impossible to estimate because the evidence wasn't available. Oh, you dropped off there, Mark. Yeah, but I wonder if Rukia wants to share our email and we can have a separate conversation. I just wonder, of course, I don't want to run out of time, and this is an interesting question. Does anybody else have a question on a recap from last week? Cool. I'm sorry, Mark, to move us on. Just scared I don't leave enough time for my colleagues at the end. So what we're going to do this basically what we're going to cover today. We're going to do a bit of an exercise around decision making and thinking about commissioning from a system level perspective. Next, we're going to look at some methods for economic evaluation at national versus local level. And then after the break, we're going to just cover 2 examples of how we've been using health economics and economic evaluation at system or organizational level. And then my colleague Ihan will cover some methods for determining causality, which is an important part of economic evaluation or value for money type analysis, especially at system or organizational level. So the aim of this first part is to get you thinking about decision making from a local commissioning perspective, as I've said, and essentially when we're making decisions at local level, resources are limited. So just want to kind of get you thinking from that perspective before we go to the rest of the session. And what I'll do is I'll link back to some other concepts around scarcity, choice and opportunity cost as well. So what I'd like you to do is imagine that you're COPD commissioner. I've just chosen COPD as an example, but this would work across any commissioning area. So feel free to pretend you're commissioning elsewhere. But you need to decide where to allocate funding across the COPD pathway for the next financial year. And you've done some work with your colleagues locally, reviewed some evidence, and you've come up with some planned activities to cover across the different pathways for COPD. But the problem is that estimated spend for planned activities now outweighs the actual budget that you have locally to deliver the services. So on the next slide, I've included some hypothetical information on planned activities and their associated cost. Don't worry, this is just to provide you an idea of different types of interventions along the different parts of the pathway. It's intended more to kind of provide you with an idea of kind of the complexity or the challenges of making these decisions, especially if you've got lots of smaller programs, and even some of these programs might be delivered within different teams, within different services. So yeah, I think it's just about recognizing the complexity of doing this sort of work. So I'm not going to ask you to decide where to cut funding or anything like that. It's just more for illustrative purposes. But what I want you to do is consider the following 3 questions. I do have a Jamboard, but I wonder, because we're so few, will we just stick to the chat? I think that might be a better use of time. I might make it a bit more interactive as well. So yeah, so we've got 3 questions. So the first is, what should commissioners consider when making funding and resource allocation decisions? The second is, what are the main challenges commissioners face when deciding what to commission? And then the third is around thinking about the perspective of your ICS, which costs and outcomes should be considered to inform funding or resource allocation decisions. So what I'm going to suggest is, if we take each one in turn, so if we start with the first one, and if you take a minute or 2 just to have a think, and then pop your ideas in the chat, or feel free to put your hand up as well and turn off your camera, and we can have a conversation. Does anyone have any questions? Right, so I'll give everyone maybe a minute or so to think about this first question. So this could include things like current service provision, how much to invest in which different services, what's the size of the population, stuff like that. So I will stop talking now. Thanks, Paul. So you've added current demand and future demand. I think that's important to consider. Anyone else have any thoughts? Patient satisfaction, that's definitely important. Thanks, Mark. I think those are all really important as well. I think it's key to try and understand the evidence base. Is there evidence of effectiveness already or cost effectiveness? How much of the cost of treatment? What's the size of the population? And inequalities is a big issue as well, especially in COPD, like across most conditions. And the issue of prevention and treatment as well. It's always a challenging one to make the case for early intervention and prevention because the outcomes aren't experienced further on in time as well. But my colleague Jack's going to come and talk in a bit about some work he's doing, resource allocation for COPD specifically. So it'd be interesting to hear his thoughts on that as well.
Sarah's got an interesting point, Lisa. The public health cost of service not given.
Yeah. So that is a really interesting part of this as well. So it's trying to think about what's the opportunity cost of investing in one area at the expense of another. And that's really important in health economics. It's just a little harder to quantify, and that kind of goes back to the point I was making around prevention and intervention. And again, going back to the need to review the evidence and making the case. And I guess now that we've got integrated care systems and hopefully with integrated care partners working together with some element of shared budgeting, if there's more deliberation, then we can maybe make the case for more investment in public health as opposed to more treatment of when things get too bad, too far along, and we keep putting funding into acute treatment for exacerbations and stuff like that. Cool. Any last thoughts? I'm just going to bring up my notes and summarize what I had, see if there's any key bits missing. So the other things to consider might be, I think we've covered most of them actually. Things around who should benefit, how much benefit are we likely to generate, who should be prioritised, but I think that links back to inequalities that Mark raised. Good. I'm going to move us on to question 2, just so that we don't run out of time before lunch. The second question is, what challenges might commissioners face when deciding what to commission? So again, I'll give you another minute or two to have a think. And then if you want to pop yourself on camera or add anything to the chat, please do.
Political influences, Jasmine says. Workforce capacity and resource constraints.
I think both of those are really, really important, especially, again, kind of linking back to working across integrated care systems, different places with different priorities, different partners with different priorities, and navigating that political context can even be more challenging than trying to allocate resources.
And Mark says difficulty in getting agreement to invest in prevention versus treatment of current cases, lack of comprehensive evidence, conflict of organizational objectives.
Yeah, I think that's key as well as the lack of comprehensive evidence, or even one challenge when I worked in ICS, I found you don't even have do not allocate the time or the funding maybe to be able to allocate the evidence really needed to make more informed decisions. Just to go back to Paul's point as well around workforce capacity and resource constraints, here I probably only specifically talked about funding for resources, but when you couple that with the workforce constraints as well, even if you plan to provide these services, it may be even difficult to deliver them if the staffing or resourcing issues are kind of resolved as well. And yeah, conflicting organisational objectives is a massive challenge. Does anyone have experience of kind of, since been working more in an integrated way, of kind of overcoming these conflicting objectives across different organizations or different patches? It's a big question, so you don't need to answer. I will just give another couple of seconds on this one. I think Jasmine might be writing a comment, and then we would, but if you want to start thinking about the next question, what kind of costs and outcomes may be benefits or consequences as well, should be considered to help inform decisions. Thanks, Jasmine. I think I might keep your questions around public health for when Jack comes, and he's going to talk about his work, and what he's basically trying to do is, within different ICSs, is map out the pathway for COPD, including everything from public health to prevention to treatment and all that kind of stuff, and then work with systems to prioritise which interventions. So it might be interesting to hear his perspective on that. But yeah, so if anybody wants to add anything on the third question, please do. Maybe do 2 minutes on this one, just because of timing. So I can give some examples of costs. Oh, we've got some coming in. Current financial position, I think that's important. Size of the clinical problem, financial impact. All important. Other types of outcomes might be specifically interested in, improvements in health, changes in resource use, so reduction in acute admissions or exacerbations, patient satisfaction is all we might be interested in, whether or not there might be improved access for certain population groups, how many lives might be saved, and things like minimizing cost as well across the pathway. So how is there any way to quantify those effects of those early interventions, potentially in the short term, but especially in the longer term. And then also we might be interested in trying to measure things like improved efficiency, service delivery. Cool. I'm going to move us on just so that I make sure everyone's got enough time for a break. But what I hope that this demonstrated is the challenges that ICSs face around resource allocation decision making. And this really relates to the economic problem that exists in the NHS, not just the NHS, across all societies and sectors as well. And it's about how best to allocate our scarce resources. So the NHS itself only has limited resources, but the need for healthcare is boundless. And then this leads to scarcity, which means that choices need to be made. They could be made at national level around those allocations that I showed earlier across different parts of the NHS, at ICS level and also at place level and provider level. And those decisions typically relate to what to deliver, how to deliver, how much and for whom. And then this really links back to the concept of opportunity cost, which Will would have covered as well last week. So just a bit of a reminder, the opportunity cost is of investing resources in one area leads to benefits foregone from using those particular resources to another area. So if we think back to the COPD example, let's imagine that the ICS or the chief finance officer decides, actually, no, we're gonna fund that extra £600,000 so that you can deliver the pathway you want to deliver. But in doing that, then he decides to cut the diabetes budget, for example, by £600,000. So in this example, there would be kind of like health and other benefits foregone to people with diabetes, because that funding now is going to people with COPD. So it's basically kind of the benefits to another cohort at the expense of another group of patients in an area. So I hope that kind of brings it all together and kind of captures it. Does anyone have any questions before I move on to the next section? Cool. I'm going to move us on then. Oh, Mark, do you want to come in?
Sorry, it's just a very brief question, which is about the constraints that we face. So very often NHS England allocates budgets which are specifically appended to individual disease pathways. And if there's underspend in those, that's apparent at the end of Q3. What we don't have is the ability to transfer that grant to do something in diabetes. So if we know we're just not going to spend all the COPD money, what we don't have at the minute is the ability to transfer that fund into diabetes if we thought we could do something good in diabetes. And it's a terrible constraint. And I just think it's a terrible way for NHS England to make the best of the money that they actually have, because taking it all back in at the end of the year, the unspent stuff, disadvantages patients that we could have actually done something for in Q4, for example, if they'd been more flexible with it.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. Where sometimes kind of hasty decisions might be made to fund something in that last part of the year, which if you had, in the grand scheme of things, if more time is allocated and there was more flexibility, you could probably allocate that a lot more sensibly. So I completely agree. I just don't know how we can solve that problem, to be honest.
I was hoping the health economics unit might have influence at the centre.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, because I guess those decisions are made at like a national level. I suppose maybe the new health secretary, but I'm not too convinced by that. Thank you, Mark. So in the next section of this first part of the session, I'm going to cover use of methods for economic evaluation. I'm going to start with kind of more at a national level, and then kind of introduce the more kind of traditional economic evaluation methods, and then talk about kind of how and if they're then used at local level, and why and how that might vary. So this figure is in a conceptual model, if you could say that, of the current funding and commissioning landscape in England. And it just shows the funding flows and accountability flows as well, and some other factors. But I'm just going to use it here just to show the funding flows and at different levels. So at the top, at the national level, we've got Department of Health and Social Care. We've got like the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities as well. And then we've got other bodies like NHS England and Improvement, local democratic accountability as well. You can see there's a clear then flow of funding down into integrated care systems. So this is where that 100 and I think we're at 8 billion goes directly into, and then from there it's allocated across the different integrated care systems across England, who then allocate funding and some commissioning decisions down to place level, which then flows down into the commissioning of services. So this is kind of considered more at provider level. My question is around this is what or where might methods for health economic evaluation typically be used to inform decision making? Would it be kind of at national level, system or place or provider? And does anyone have any thoughts on that? You can pop them in the chat or turn your camera off and say hello. Give you a few seconds. If not, I might rush us along because we've only got 15 minutes before lunch and I've got a lot to cover. So I'm just going to give you the answer then. Most funding decisions are actually made, health economic methods are mostly used at a national level. And I'm going to discuss that now, and then I'll talk about system and place level before lunch as well. So methods for economic evaluation, as I said, are mostly done at national level, and they're most commonly employed by NICE. And NICE is the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, and they are responsible for recommending which treatments should be made available within the NHS, and they make these decisions based on the efficacy and value for money as well. So value for money is where health economics comes in, and it's determined using cost effectiveness analysis. And one of the main reasons why economic valuation methods are less common at local or system level is just because comprehensive cost-effective analysis takes time and requires significant funding as well for research. So what costs and outcomes do we usually consider as part of an economic evaluation at national level? So NICE stipulates that the perspective should be of the NHS and personal social care. So basically any costs to the NHS or to social care should be considered in these types of economic evaluations. And the outcome they're generally most interested in is our direct health effects, typically measured in a QALY. The time horizon then as well, they're usually interested in to measure. So the time horizon is the length of time that they would maybe model the effects of an intervention on a group of patients, for example. So NICE may stipulate a lifetime horizon, and that will depend on whether or not a particular treatment leads to increased survival, or if the benefits that the intervention generates persist for the remainder of a person's life, for example. I have a question, if anyone remembers what a QALY is from last week, but I'm going to go ahead and skip that just in the interest of time. A QALY is a single measure of health effect. It's a quality adjusted life year, basically combines quality of life with quantity of life into a single measure, and it's used as part of cost utility analysis, which is a type of cost effectiveness analysis. The quantity of life or time is basically the length of time in a given health state. So if you think about a treatment for a cancer drug, for example, a health state might be time in treatment, the length of time in treatment, and another quantity might be length of time in remission. And an individual may have different health states across those different periods in treatment, I guess. The quality element is usually measured using a quality of life measure. And basically that just collects some information on an individual basis on the perceived health state within a kind of given, based on when so if it's a study, for example, looking at the effect of a new treatment, it may collect that information at specific time periods and then see how the quality of life changes, and then that is usually generated then to estimate a quality. If I'm going too fast, please do stop and ask questions. So then when it comes to making decisions, NICE usually makes decisions based on the value of an ICER. So an ICER is an incremental cost effectiveness ratio, and it's estimated based on the costs and qualities of two different interventions. So you can see here, it'll be the cost of a new intervention minus the cost of an old intervention divided by the effects of the new minus the old. And this effect would be a quality in this example. So I've just got a quick example here of a hypothetical treatment for diabetes. So current treatment, it costs £1,000 and the quality is 0.5. The new treatment itself is cheaper by £150 and it generates an additional smaller benefit, so it increases the quality to 0.6. And this then is it's basically this calculation, the ICER. So it's considered the saving to the NHS per quality adjusted life year. In most examples, when you read or review economic evaluation papers, these are usually more likely to have an increased cost and a quality saving, increased cost and increased benefits, sorry. So that's why I've got here that it represents the additional cost to the NHS per quality. And by the benefit of having a quality at kind of national level to inform kind of resource allocation or funding decisions is because by summarising it in a common measure, it allows the comparison of different interventions for different treatments across different conditions, which is important, I guess, when the NHS is faced with kind of the problem of scarcity and opportunity cost. So just as a relative measure that they can compare against. Any quick questions on this? Because I'm conscious I run through it quickly. I'm going to go into a bit of an example anyway, so hopefully if you have any questions as we go through, they might be answered. So I've got a question here. So how does NICE determine whether or not the NHS should fund a new treatment? Does anyone have any idea of how they might make funding rules, or what decisions they might make and what rules they might apply? For those who were here last week, they may have, Wilk has covered some of this, I think. I think Jasmine's putting a note in the chat, so I might just give her a moment. Yeah, no, that is true. There is a NICE threshold, which we're going to cover in a minute. So thanks for raising this, Jasmine. the minimum threshold is £20,000, so that's the one I've referenced today, but there's it does sometimes go for 30,000, and even sometimes they do commission interventions above £30,000 per body. But that sets us up nicely for the next part, which is so basically NICE makes decisions based on the difference in costs and effects of alternative treatments or diagnostic tools, whichever they're evaluating. So this is a cost effectiveness plane. And it basically captures the decision rules applied by NICE when making resource allocation decisions. So it's got 4 quadrants: northwest, northeast, southeast, and southwest. If an ICER falls in this area, it basically means that it's more costly, and it's less effective. So it's an easy decision, basically, not to invest because it doesn't offer value for money. On the opposite end, this is a scenario where the intervention is less costly and it offers more effects, more benefits. So it's good. It's determined to be good value for money. So NICE are likely to recommend that the NHS fund this treatments that may fall in here. When an ICER falls in these quadrants, it just makes decision making a little bit more complicated. So what happens here is kind of introduces the kind of concepts around trade-offs and willingness to pay, and that's essentially what the threshold is that Jasmine alluded to in her message. So I'm going to talk about the threshold in a minute. So I'm just going to come back a second and just talk through this with an example, and then I can introduce the threshold with an example, and hopefully become a little bit more intuitive. So thinking back to the example that I just presented a moment ago, how likely do you think NICE is to recommend this treatment, and which quadrant do you think it falls into? So I might just give you a minute to pop your answers in the chat. So which quadrant, and will NICE recommend it? Thanks, Beth. Two. We've got 2 for southeast, so you're right. So it's probably around here. So what would happen if a new treatment becomes available or has been developed? It's not yet been recommended for use in the NHS. But this treatment, it's more costly, but it offers greater benefits. And the value of the ICER is about £19,000. Which quadrant do you think this falls into? And do you think the NHS will fund it? Or do you think NICE will recommend it for it to be funded by the NHS?
There's a couple of people typing away.
Cool, interesting. Mark said might recommend, Beth says but not recommend. And Imogen is coming and give the correct answer here. So yes, they will recommend it because it's below the threshold of £20,000. So it sits in the northeast. And this threshold is basically set by NICE to support decision making. There's a whole body of literature on this, on the arbitrary, sorry, I can't pronounce that word right now, and how arbitrary this figure is, and whether or not it should be changed. But I'm not going to go into that, but I can pop some links in the slides in case anybody is interested in reading more about that debate. But basically, the key takeaway really is that NICE uses this threshold and recommends any treatment that falls below it, and it basically deems them to be cost effective. And this 20k is said to represent the willingness to pay, the amount the NHS is willing to pay per quality, and it also kind of represents the opportunity cost. So the amount, that level of funding that they're willing to cope with to spend on an intervention that's more costly, which kind of represents that quantity of benefits foregone for that may be displaced by investing this in another area. And that's kind of what's captured down here as well. So in this case, you might have a cheaper intervention that's less effective, but sometimes the decision may be made to invest in it, for example. Do I have a question? Or yeah.
The question from Sandra.
It'd be good to know more about your question. Could you just explain a little bit more, please, Sandra? Drive up costs in what way?
Hi. So systems settle out to known levels, don't they? So if you know as a say provider of a new solution that there's a threshold, is there a risk that you pitch to the threshold?
That's actually a really good question. I'm going to try and answer it, but I may not quite give you the quite correct answer. But what I can do is check with my colleagues and come back to you afterwards. So these are specifically kind of decisions that are made by NICE at a national level. So that's typically where the threshold is used rather than at a local level. And this kind of decision rule method isn't typically used at system level at all. And in my next two slides, we'll kind of talk about the reasons why these methods aren't used at system level. But there may be cases, potentially, if a manufacturer of a drug, for example, might increase their costs or their sale costs as much to get as much value as possible. But I think, like, I haven't worked at NICE. I wonder, my colleague Emma's on the call. She worked at NICE many years ago, though. I wonder, are there decisions? How do NICE account for things like that? Maybe artificially increasing costs and stuff. And
I don't think manufacturers necessarily artificially raise their prices, because the pricing, certainly pharmaceuticals, is extremely complicated because they're trying to recoup numerous years of research and development. And also, depending on the launch sequence of them pharmaceuticals, they obviously want to try and maximise, whilst it's under patent, the amount of profit that they can achieve on a particular product. So what you generally find is that a lot of pharmaceutical companies these days have to put in what are called patient access schemes, which are essentially either straight discounts, or they do things like, there was a product called Lucentis for age-related macular degeneration, where the manufacturer will fund a certain number of injections depending on what the trial conditions are. So generally, I don't think they artificially inflate. They generally have to put in discount schemes to get it anywhere near the 30k threshold. Certainly for pharmaceuticals. I didn't work on the medical devices or diagnostics, but I presume it's quite similar.
If I can jump in there, Emma, I did work in medical devices for 20 years.
Yeah.
And we used to try and get the highest price we possibly could. That has all changed now. When I started, a hip would cost anywhere from £3,000 to £4,000. Same hip now is about 600. So I think the introduction of the tower system, and my last role was in NHS procurement, so I dealt exclusively with the towers, has driven, you know, that there is no scope for that. You won't get any business if you try and quote to the highest value you think you can get. You've got to literally price it, you know, and offer extra bonus discounts and so on. So it's very tightly controlled how much they can actually charge. Whether they want to charge that or not, they're kind of fixed into it because of the way the towers are structured.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate that jumping in there. I've gone over by 3 minutes, so I've got 2 last slides left. So if we maybe quickly do these before. Oh, sugar, I don't. I've got more than 2. So I'm going to quickly go through this actually. So if NICE recommends treatment to the NHS, that it should be funded and should be made available to patients, doesn't necessarily mean that patients will benefit right away. So I've got a question of why this might be the case. I'm just going to quickly answer that question for you. This is because the responsibility of commissioning funding decisions is at a local level, so usually with integrated care systems or systems providers. But also prescribing decisions, for example, are made at local decisions, and you've got local formularies who are responsible for deciding what medications to make available and what treatments to make available. These are usually composed of clinicians and other patient groups and stuff like that. But here's kind of an example of a treatment that was recommended by NICE in March of last year. So they recommended uniform coverage basically of Freestyle Libre, which is a tech basically that kind of provides kind of flash glucose monitoring for patients with type 1 diabetes. And this is the situation kind of a couple of months later. And what you can see is that some areas have picked that up picked up that decision quite quickly and made sure that this treatment was available for the population that it provides care for. But then other areas were still kind of lagging behind. So I just kind of want to demonstrate with this that although NICE makes a decision, makes a recommendation, sometimes it can take a little bit longer for that to filter through and actually for the treatment to be made available and offered to patients. I'm sorry to rush us ahead. At a local level, and I've kind of touched on this a few times, these kind of more advanced traditional methods that I've gone through today are not typically used at system level. I might give you guys maybe a minute or two if you want to pop anything in the chat if you think this might be the case, or would I just go ahead and give you the answers, because maybe people want to come for a break, so maybe I'll just give you the answers, and I can stay on the call if anyone has any questions while we take a break. So there's a couple of reasons for it basically. The first one that I've added in here is budget. And this is specifically budget for evidence generation and evaluations. And the funding allocated to this is usually a lot lower or a lot smaller at service level or system level. So it's not really possible to do these large scale economic evaluations, for example, long randomized control trials, which are typically the ones that are used to inform decision making by NICE. The second is perspective. So it's a lot narrower, and it will depend really on the organisation commissioning or choosing to provide an intervention. They won't typically take into account a longer time horizon. If we think about funding cycles, they usually happen every 12 months. And we've touched on this before earlier on as well today. So the ICSs are typically only thinking about benefits over the next 12 months. So they can usually focus on short-term effects like in admissions and stuff like that. And then when it comes to quantifying effects, usually we're hampered as well by the type of evidence we have available. We usually are relying on routinely collected or publicly available data, or if we have additional time or resource, we can generate evidence from the literature as well. But we don't have the luxury of doing RCTs and stuff like that to get exactly what information we need to be able to do the analysis and the modelling that's needed. So that's another constraint. When it comes to concepts like QALYs and ICERs, if you're not familiar with them, or if people in finance teams and other teams aren't familiar with them, it can be difficult to interpret and explain and stuff like that. So they're kind of less commonly used as well for that reason. When it comes to the quality itself, I mentioned the quality of life measure tools which are often used. They're less used at local or system level. They're not routinely collected for most conditions. You might have some routinely collected for some surgical interventions. I can't remember off the top of my head now. But if they're not routinely collected, it's actually quite resource intensive and costly to collect that information from patients. And as I mentioned already, when it comes to study design, we have to rely on kind of simpler quasi-experimental study designs. Any quick questions on any of this before we take maybe a quick 5-minute break? You don't have to ask a question. If we come back at 2:10, and if anyone has any questions at that point as well, we could take them.
I think that sounds like a good idea. There's some thumbs up.
Go.
So
Sorry
10
to rush
past.
through that part.
See everybody in a bit.
Thanks.
Hello.
Hello. I'm back.
Hey.
Oh, I think I might actually have to go and put the heating on in a minute. I'm getting cold. Promised myself I wouldn't put it on until Christmas so the kids could have a present.
Jack seems to have gotten tied up.
Oh no.
Yeah.
We could put him at the end then, you know, right? Maybe.
Yeah, that's maybe a good idea. We might just run out of time, but I can share slides or something. Yeah. If he doesn't make it, I can talk at the end.
How long's he likely to be held up for, Lisa? Did he say? Or
no.
Is he wrapping up from this morning's session?
Yeah, I'll try and give him a call again. I'll just go off there for a sec.
Okay. Actually, blue skies here today. I haven't seen blue skies for days.
It's blue skies in Liverpool too.
Is it?
Yeah.
You get them over there. Every time I've been to Liverpool, it rains.
Has it? It's probably
Yeah.
like Manchester like that. Every time I land on Manchester.
Yeah, but on Manchester, nobody expects sunshine in Manchester.
No, it's quite good here today.
The cloud cover breaks for 10 seconds, everybody in Manchester gets sunburn.
What I'll do is I'm kind of familiar with the program anyway. So I will maybe do 5 minutes on Jack's section for him and not go into too much detail. But if anyone's interested in learning more about this program and this method, we can maybe share our email address and we can set up a separate call. How does that sound?
Or we shared our STAR workshops.
Yeah, that's potentially true as well. Cool. I'll just get cracking anyway. So what we're going to, does anyone have any questions on the part that we just finished up on around challenges for using traditional methods at local level? Good. Mark, so you're interested in learning more about STAR, is it?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Cool. Okay.
Think you're good to carry on, Lisa?
I had a gummy bear just at that moment. Cool. What I'll do in this part, what we're going to do is provide 2 examples of how we've been using health economics for economic evaluation and the work we've been doing to support local systems or evaluate different technologies at like a local level. One of those methods is STAR, which is a socio-technical approach to allocation of resources. And the second then is more around economic evaluation or value for money type analysis of interventions to see their impact locally and to support kind of local decision making around whether or not to implement or invest. And as part of this, we'll also talk about include a part around determining causality in the types of analysis we would do. Cool. So Jack, unfortunately, is not here. So I'm going to do a quick 1 or 2 minutes on STAR, which is being rebranded as Smarter Spending Population Health Programme. But we will share our information and happy to have a discussion with anybody who's more interested in who would like to learn more about this. Cool. So quickly share. I've not seen these slides, so I'm apologize in advance. I will do my best. So basically, this is a program of work that we are delivering in collaboration with the strategy unit. And the aim really is around using COPD as an exemplar pathway to run the STAR process. I'll go into a bit more detail on the STAR process in a moment, but these are just examples the ICSs that we're working with at the moment. But the main thing really think about STAR is about taking a common sense approach to working out how we can move resources around and create more value without spending more. The method was developed by academics at the London School of Economics, and it was led by Gwyn Bevan, who's an Emerita Professor of Policy Analysis at LSE Department of Management. And he's been providing advice as well to us on the programme. The key thing really about STAR, what differentiates it from kind of like normal type of cost related decision making, is that it's concerned more with value, and three different types of value in particular: effective value, or what's also known as personal value, efficient value or technical value, and allocative value as well. So the personal value is really about ensuring that everybody within a health system is receiving the interventions that's needed really to address their need and also their personal preferences for care. In terms of the technical value, then that's more around whether or not services are being delivered as efficiently as possible. So we're getting the most we can for whatever level of funding is made available to deliver a service. In terms of allocative value, this is considered more kind of at a allocated value from a societal rather than a productive perspective. And it's ensuring the health of the economy is investing the right mix of services to address the needs of the population. I'm going to just skip on this as well. So just to touch again on allocative efficiency, it's about doing the right amount of the right things. It tries to take account of like social determinants, behaviours, environmental and clinical factors, with the aim then of maximising population health. It comes back to this concept of scarcity and resources. So we have scarce resources and we know that. So we need to make better choices about what and how we're going to deliver. And the STAR method was developed to allow systems, or I think at the time when it was first trialled, it was, I can't quite remember now off the top of my head, so I'm going to move on. So it's about understanding what interventions generate the most value for a population through value for money analysis and stakeholder engagement. So it's really a core part of it is that stakeholder engagement and meeting locally, bringing together partners in one place and providing them with information and evidence, evidence specifically relating to the number of people who are availing of a treatment, the number benefiting, and a quantification of what that benefit is as well. And then the ultimate aim then is to hope that this would lead to more informed resource allocation decisions across the health system, resulting in improved outcomes for the same or a lower cost potentially. Cool, I've just gone through that part. And I think this is the last slide I'll cover on this because it covers the socio and technical part, which I've kind of alluded to already. But STAR, as I mentioned, stands for the socio-technical allocation of resources. And it's all about bringing patients and clinicians and kind of service managers and others together to understand or have kind of a whole picture view of what interventions are being delivered along the pathway, who's benefiting, and what's the benefit of that. In the STAR programme, the way that we've been able to provide this evidence for people who attend the decision conferences or the stakeholder engagement groups is we've done a combination of going direct to systems, but not just systems, but providers as well, asking them to provide information on the number receiving treatment. So that's a lot easier than the benefit side, which is kind of the more complicated part. What we've done, we did kind of a large scale systematic review of COPD. We tried to gather evidence from the literature on quality estimates for all these different types of interventions. And then where there were gaps in the evidence, we tried to fill this by having conversations with clinicians and others and patients as well at the decision conferences to better refine those value of benefits estimates. So the socio part of STAR is that kind of social part, I guess, bringing together different stakeholders who are involved in providing care across the entirety of the pathway. And the technical parts cover those kind of more data-driven or evidence-driven components. So the number of people who benefit and the benefit as well and stuff like that. That was a very kind of whistle-top summary of something that I'm only peripherally involved with. But does anyone have any questions on any of that? I forgot to say actually that the reason why we're focusing on these costs and benefits is we try and apply the same principles as cost effectiveness analysis. So when you have all your costs and all your benefits, you can then compare those incrementally against the different interventions and come up with that kind of single value for estimate to compare across the different interventions and the different parts of the pathway. I think Sandra's writing, so I'm going to stop talking for a minute.
I like the idea of opening out the conversation across the pathway, Sarah says.
Yeah. I think that's been one of the added value for sure. Emma, do you want to come in and say anything? Because I know you've been involved in STAR as well.
Yeah, so both myself and Paul, who's also on the call, I've worked on the Coventry and the Northampton sort of decision conferences, and it's really powerful when you get sort of the patients in the room, clinicians, and people that are responsible for either commissioning or delivering the services all together, looking at how people value those services and collectively agreeing that all together, so that across the system you all agree, you know, which of the interventions do we think provide the most benefit to individuals, or for the prevention of like, for example, COPD, things like smoking cessation. And then through the technical element, we can then go back and look at, well, how do we change those dials that Lisa showed before, so that how can we make those even more efficient? How do you get that bang for your buck? So if you've got, say, a smoking cessation service and you're only getting sort of 10% of people through that are quitting, can we compare that to national evidence to then look at how can we look at perhaps increasing that level of number of quitters so that you're getting that bang for your buck, for example? Does that help?
I'm going to move. Thanks, Emma. That was really, really useful, and thanks for answering Sandra's question. I'm going to move this on. This is just a flavour of STAR. Please do reach out to us if you have any questions. I'm sure the guys will be delighted to start to talk and circulate some of the findings and their experience of delivering this locally. And I think the plan is to expand upon the programme again next year and look at other potential condition areas. The idea, actually, I'll finish on this, is that it would be developed into something like I think like a package almost, that it's something that ICSs could trial and use on their own. The challenge, I think, with doing that though is having an external team come in to do the facilitation when you're trying to bring together different groups from across the system. I think that's probably the value add of having an external team come in. Right, I'm going to jump ahead. Sorry, Ian, I'm going to probably be 10 more minutes before I pass to you. That's okay. I'll just set you up basically. Cool. Great. Sorry, just updating my slides. What I'm going to do is talk about economic evaluation, and I'll give an intro to how we use economic evaluation and how it like kind of links back to work we do in generally on evaluations. I'm going to have to do this quite quickly, so I've included a case study, but I might just skip through some parts of it. So I've included this slide. It's basically from the Magenta book, but this covers kind of like the comprehensive mixed method type of evaluation that one could do if they were evaluating a program or intervention or whatever it may be. It's got 3 stages: scoping, designing, conducting. It can have an evaluation usually either has a process or an impact element to it, and then if you're including a value for money component to it, this is captured by the kind of purple part of this conceptual diagram. So what I'm going to do, so this is just kind of, if you have this in the back of your mind, usually when we do an economic evaluation, we're doing it as part of an evaluation. So it's more like an economic analysis or value for money analysis. And that's usually because systems providers are also interested in process or impact measures in general, as well as value for money estimates. So what I'm going to do is just talk through a general framework for how we do this type of work at the Health Economics Unit. We start by defining the decision problem. So this is really key to understanding why the intervention is needed and how it will be implemented, its purpose and aims. At this point as well, we review any existing evidence on effectiveness or cost effectiveness, just to see what evidence is out there really. We also start to think about what comparators are available. So usually if it's maybe an intervention implemented at in primary care, for example, there might be no specific comparator group, but we can do maybe some case control matching and identify suitable comparator in the primary care data, for example. We'll also define your population and start to think about the perspective as well. And the perspective will usually be that of who's making the decision. So does an ICS want to make a decision to commission an intervention across the whole patch, or is it just a single provider looking to introduce a new tech or pilot a new waitlist algorithm, for example? So once we've really kind of understood what the intervention is and what the decision problem is, we start to think about the expected impact. And this is all typically includes a review of the current pathway to see what the impact is on the pathway, and also mapping expected benefits and resources. And this is done using a logic model. And this is kind of like a key part really of the work we do, because without taking the time to do this, it makes it a lot more difficult to kind of at a later stage to try and identify what measures you're interested in, or what you're trying to demonstrate in terms of effect and stuff like that. And usually then we'll use the pathway mapping exercise and logic model to decide what to measure in terms of cost and outcomes. And we'll use as well kind of the work we've done this early stage around the evidence to see what's available, and we're scoping to identify potential data sources, and we'll start to think about our methods for demonstrating impact. The next stage then usually involves deciding on methods and approach for economic evaluation. So this will usually involve some level of cost analysis or outcomes analysis or resource use analysis, whatever it may be. as well as determining kind of our plans for any economic modelling as well that we would do. And then we carry out the evaluation. So we do any analysis that we're going to do. And Yehan's going to touch on the different methods that we might use when we're trying to determine causality, when we've got to do like kind of quasi-experimental study designs and stuff like that. And then we also undertake any modelling we need to do. So I'm not going to go into modelling today. But my colleague Heather, I think not in the next section, but in the one after that, is going to talk about the different types of modelling techniques like decision tree modelling and Markov modelling, which are mostly used really in health economics. And we may as well synthesize evidence from the literature. A moment ago, when I talked about the challenges and limitations, I said that we're often hampered by what routinely available data there is in the system. So sometimes to kind of address some of the gaps, we might do a literature review alongside the project. Depending on the size of the project, this could just be a rapid review rather than a full-scale systematic literature review. And then we'll also ensure that we quality assure and validate our measures. And then lastly, everything is summarised in a report and findings shared with the system or whoever the commissioning body is. I'm not going to go through the case study because I don't think that's fair on Yehan, and she won't get to go through all the bits and pieces. But basically, these couple of slides here just kind of demonstrate using a hypothetical example based on some work we did do. What involves kind of around comparing the pathways, what a logic model is, an example of a logic model we produced, and how it works, and how the idea is that it maps. You start with your expected impact, and then you think about what resources are required to achieve that impact. So what inputs are required, what activities need to take place, what these activities then lead to in terms of outputs, and how those outputs then directly lead to benefits, which then ultimately leads to your intended impact. So that's why I kind of mentioned earlier why this part is key, really, because you can clearly kind of see here the quantifiable things that you would need to measure to then be able to try and determine some of these process and outcome effects. Which I kind of just touched on now. And then we decide on our methods and our approach. For this one, for this particular study, it was in primary care. So the study design could have been a propensity score case control study. And then here I just touched on some of the measurements that we were interested in costs. And then just the type of economic model that we would do, which is a budget impact model. And this is to assess more affordability, because that was the interest of the team who commissioned the research. And I'm going to stop. I'm so sorry for rushing through this. But one last thing. So Yehan's going to talk about different methods for determining causality, and the future sessions will go into a lot more detail on economic analysis and modelling methods. So yeah, thank you. If anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and I can address them while Yehan is presenting. Sorry, Yehan.
Oh, it's no problem at all. Thank you for this comprehensive introduction. It's, yeah, all very nicely paced. So I'm gonna share my screen, I think. So my topic is about causality, but before anything, I just want to ask you, have you heard about the What Works network? Or we all know NICE is here. Does any one of you know about any other organizations listed here? Okay, so I assume NICE is the only organization that we know.
Embarrassed to say that's the only one I've heard of on there.
Okay, but this is government initiative started 10 years ago to really to find out what works, because that's what some politicians are interested about. So Education Endowment Foundation is about evidence for education. So NICE obviously is for evidence about health. So all the others are, as you can infer from the title, are about different areas of interventions. So Lisa introduced to us how to do economic evaluation and how to do all those kind of calculations. However, sometimes we forget fundamentally, does the intervention work? And how do we determine if they work or not? So that's why after we get a flavor of economic evaluation, we go back to the beginning and ask the question, what works, whether it works, and how can we be sure of that? So that's my topic, and I'm gonna introduce quickly about our like maybe some of the topics you are already familiar with, like correlation versus causation. And also I'm gonna give you an overview of the common evaluation approaches in public health, and then give you some rules of thumb to follow common evaluation designs. So I'm sure maybe half of you have heard about this story before, but it's worth retelling because it's always a nice kind of story to capture the difference between correlation and causation. So if you see a graph that shows that the ice cream sales increases with the number of drownings, what can we conclude from that? Well, some headline, we can already imagine that some newspaper outlets may say, oh, ice cream sales cause drownings. So let's cut the sales to prevent drownings. So we already know what's the problem with this line of reasoning, because those two aren't just moving together. It's not one causing the other. We know the common cause behind this is summer or warm temperature. So now we know it's important to distinguish correlation from causation. And there are actually three prerequisites for us to be able to make a causal claim. The first is temporal sequence. So the cause need to precede the effect in order to call it a cause. And the second is they need to move together, like they co-vary in a sense. And third is the correlation is spurious. So that's why we can see in this in the right-hand diagram, we see a wind, we see a spinning windmill, we see the Don Quixote waving his hand, and we know the wind is the cause, and Don Quixote is just correlated with that. And now let's move on to the more concrete, real-life examples. So why we're so keen to differentiate correlation from causation? Why does it matter? Because identifying those causal relationships is the key to sound policymaking. So back to like 50 years ago, when the relationship between smoking and mortality was still not super clear, then we know that this British doctor study really made a huge difference to the policymaking, because they, for the first time, established a convincing causal link. As you can see in the graph, they sent out survey questions to thousands of doctors, asking them whether they smoke or not, and monitored their life trajectories through the death registries. And they found that on average, smokers lived 10 years less than non-smokers. And that's why we now have the policies like public smoking ban in certain venues. And also we have the free NHS service to help us, to have smokers quit smoking if they want to. And now let's move on to to introduce another another example, which is the contrary of good evidence. So if you look at the right-hand figure, you see the x-axis represents the chocolate consumption, while the y-axis represents the number of Nobel laureates. So what we can see here is, oh, there seems to be a positive correlation between those two variables. Shall we then conclude that eating more chocolate will improve one's cognitive function? We probably cannot, because there might be some alternative explanation. Yeah, Phil, you can use this evidence to make your claim. So it's published in the New England Journal of Medicine. So it's actually, yeah, a very influential study. Although, yeah, it's probably unfair to say the authors like make this kind of study, but the author was actually quite modest when he described this relationship. So we know there are other factors like how wealthy those countries are, and that the consumption is at national level, not at individual level, may really make us think again whether this is a genuine causal relationship. And so the take-home message from this example is that we need to be wary of spurious correlation and really try to seek the genuine causal relationships. So how do we infer those genuine causal relationships? So one of the most important factors is to find a comparison group. So, and I'm not sure if you have all read about the story in the book of Daniel. So it's a very simple story. So we were told in the story that Daniel and his 3 friends were deported to Babylon after the fall of Jerusalem. And the king gave them a daily allowance of food and wine from the royal table. So it was a privilege, in fact. But Daniel determined not to be defiled by this king's allowance and asked the chief eunuch to spare him from his allowance. So did you know what he did to persuade the eunuch? Actually, he is one of the first pioneer in evidence-based decision-making. So what he did is, so he asked the eunuch, please allow your servants a 10 days trial during which we are given only vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then you can compare our looks with those of the boys who eat the king's food. And then you can go and tell which group looks better and decide for yourself. So the eunuch agreed and then put them on the 10 days trial. And after 10 days, Daniel and his friends looked better and fatter. And that's how they decided, okay, to comply with Daniel's request and withdraw their allowance and gave them vegetables instead. So if we look closer to this narrative, it actually has all of the key ingredients of evidence-based decision making. So here we can see the vegetable-based meal as the intervention, their looks and their condition as the outcome. So the other group of boys are the comparison group. So 10 days trial is actually, trial implementation. And looking better and fatter is a kind of effect estimate. So the result is the decision. So I hope that you can, use this story to help you navigate in your reading or interpretation of other evidence as well. In fact, PCAUS is one of the most popular evaluation framework. And here, I know that the population intervention outcome setting, they're all covered like previously, or they will be covered later. So I'm just focusing on this comparison group part, because regardless of what evaluation methods you choose, ultimately the key difference is just how you choose them and how you define them. So here is a broad overview of the 3 approaches to infer causality. And the most probably the most common one is the pre-experiment. We just look at what happens before and after, and we don't have a control group. We also have the non-randomized and quasi-experimental experiments, and this kind of approach, the key is that it has some control group, but there is no randomization, and there is before and after comparison. And sometimes some observational studies, like case control cohort studies, also belong to this group. And then finally, we have the randomized control trials, where we have a control group and we have the randomization, and it's often it's often considered as the golden standard for inferring causality. So the causal power, as you can see here, increases as we move from left to right. So just a quick recap on what is a randomized control trial. So in essence, in an RCT, the experimenters try to create a parallel universe where in that group, where basically two groups of participants, they're similar on average in the profile, and the only difference is the intervention. And so if we observe any difference in outcomes, we can attribute the difference to the intervention and can be then quite sure that this effect happened because of the intervention. And so let's look at one of the example in real life. So some researchers, they want to know whether infant simulator programs prevent teenager pregnancy. So the context of this study is that in a lot of high or even middle income countries, infant simulator programs are actually quite widely used, because people assume that if you give teenagers a baby, like a baby toy, which who will cry and who will ask for food and complain, those teenagers will then associate having a baby with some negative experience, and that there will be less pregnancy as a result. However, after conducting an RCT, they give some teenagers these simulators and not giving it to another group. They actually observed backfire results. So people who are given the babies are actually more likely to result in teenager pregnancy. So this tells us that indeed we need to evaluate our program, and we cannot just assume something may work in theory also works in practice. And also we need to, the best practice is to have a comparison if we can, to rule out alternative confounding effects. However, in a lot of cases, an RCT is not always possible because of time, budget, ethical constraints. So as an alternative, we know sometimes simple pre-post is also very easy. It's like most of the time it's quite easy to implement. So that's why this can also be used in some cases. However, there are some prerequisites. The first is that we need to know when the intervention happened. So we need to have a precise day so that we know what is before and what is after. And we also need to make sure that there isn't too much background noises. So if there is strong seasonality or underlying trends, then any changes we observe may be attributable to those noise other than the intervention. So here is a real-world example where the researchers wanted to know whether the COVID test to secure intervention increased weekly lateral flow test uptake in Royal Hampton. So as we can observe in this diagram, that the researchers just measured the uptake before and 2 weeks before the intervention versus 2 weeks after the intervention, and also highlighted other potentially confounding period like Easter break. And as we can observe from this figure, that the uptake increased quite a lot after the launch date. And because there isn't too much background noise, we can be reasonably confident that the intervention worked. And I also wanted to note that this evaluation was conducted across multiple campuses. So it's not just based on a single one, which further increased our confidence of the results. And very similarly, we can also conduct interrupted time series study. It's very similar to pre-post. The key difference is that in this design, we tend to measure multiple times before and after intervention. And those measurements are usually like quite evenly spaced. And we also tend to have more control because we can implement the intervention, temporarily pause it, and then reinstate it. So in this way, it's more flexible than pre-post. Yeah, I may. Okay, thanks, Jasmine. So here's a real-world example. So the researchers wanted to know whether the minimum unit pricing reduced alcohol purchases in Wales. So the context is in 2020, Wales introduced a minimum price of 50 pence per unit of alcohol, and they couldn't evaluate this by an RCT because obviously it's a nationwide policy. So everybody will be equally influenced by it. So no way to run an RCT. So they found out, as you can see in this diagram, as the price goes up, the consumption goes down. So that is also a very convincing evidence. So next we have the quasi-experimental method. So here what we're trying to do is that, okay, we cannot randomize people. Then what we can instead is to find a group of people that are similar enough to our intervention group so that we can still make some counterfactual claims out of it. So for example, so I won't go into the details. So basically, there are multiple different ways to create such a comparison group, and one of the most common way is the propensity score matching. And so, yeah, I won't be covering it here, but I will be given an example where this method was used. So some researchers wanted to know whether a conditional cash transfer program increased leprosy treatment adherence and cure. So what they did was they found a group of people who are very similar in like health conditions and other general demographic profiles, except that they didn't receive this cash transfer. So the reason they did the matching was because if they just compare people who received it versus people who didn't receive it, there might be some confounding factors because only poorer people received this cash transfer. So to be able to really make the comparison, we need to find the people that are similar in a lot of different profiles, except that they didn't receive it. So yeah, the results were positive. Yeah, so this is another example to show the potential of the quasi-experimental method. And then finally, I want to briefly introduce difference in difference. So it's also slightly similar to the before and after, except that it has a comparison group. And also we are comparing people, two groups of people over time and see whether there is any difference between the two groups. And one key assumption of this method is parallel trend assumption. So it's not just comparing two random groups, these two groups actually need to have similar trend in outcomes before the intervention, so that we can assume that absence of any interventions, the two groups will continue to be parallel in a sense. And if we observed some difference, then the difference can be attributed to the intervention. So one example is the study that won Card and Gruger Nobel Prize last year. So they wanted to know whether increase in minimum wage hurt employment among lowly paid workers. So here again, RCT is not an option because you cannot randomly assign people higher or lower wage. So what they did is they identified a treatment group, which are restaurant waiters in New Jersey, and a control group, which are restaurant waiters in Eastern Pennsylvania. So those areas are closely adjacent to each other, and they have very similar wages. And like their trend of wages are very similar over the years. So they did this difference in difference study, and after New Jersey introduced the minimum wage, they actually observed that the wage didn't decrease as people expected. It actually increased. So it's quite convincing evidence to support the giving lowly paid workers some security and not to be overcautious about the potential effects on job demand. So just to wrap up, here are some rules of thumb for those evaluation designs that I just covered. So they're not definitive, and there isn't like a comprehensive guide like, oh, under this and that condition, we should use which evaluation method. The reason is because every project has different context, has different budget and stakeholders stuff. So there are always trade-offs to be made. So as long as we know that which evaluation method tends to have more causal power and which method tends to be easier to implement, requires less data, then we can make proper trade-offs with the inputs of all the stakeholders involved. So conscious of the time, we probably won't have time to have a quiz here, but feel free to post any questions if you have one in the chat, and I will now pass over to Kia. Thank you.
Any questions? You could just come along and chat rather than typing. We've got 2 minutes left. Thank you, Johan, and thank you, Lisa. So I've put the link for the feedback form on the chat area. We would really appreciate if you could click on the link and give us a feedback for help us improve our workshops next sessions. And then our next session is on the 10th of November at 10 AM, and it's a module 3 critical appraisal of published economic evaluation. Hope to see you all there. If there isn't anything else, then we could close the call 1 minute to 3, which is on time. Thank you. So these are MDSN. It will be on, and Charlotte will be circulating them. So yes, the slides will be available. Okay, I'm going to stop recording now, and it will be the recordings available too. So we'll stop now. Thank you.